Great. Welcome, everybody. One more time, this event is being recorded, so you are aware, and we're going to go ahead and get started.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Just as one more reminder, we do have ASL and Spanish interpretation available tonight. For anyone who may be using ASL interpretation, our interpreters are ASL interpreter Sarah and ASL interpreter Alyssa. We will spotlight the active interpreter throughout the presentation, but please feel free to let us know in the chat if you need any assistance.
Para personas que hablen español, deben de saber que tenemos interpretación en vivo. Por favor, de hacer clic en el globo en la parte inferior de la pantalla y selecciona español para oír la interpretación. Si necesitan ayuda, por favor, piden ayuda en el chat y yo les puedo ayudar. También es necesario tocar donde dice silenciar audio original para solo escuchar al intérprete.
Welcome to Postvention as Prevention, supporting suicide law survivors saves lives. I'm Aubrey Robinson, NAMI-NYC's education coordinator, and I'm glad you've made time for this critical topic. Losing someone to suicide is a devastating and isolating experience. Unlike other types of grief, suicide bereavement is unique and deeply complex. Tonight, we'll explore what makes this experience so distinct and discuss how we can better support law survivors and ourselves in the aftermath of such a tragedy. We'll also delve into the lasting impact of suicide on our communities and review the resources available to help us move forward together. We're fortunate to have Shannon Donick with us tonight. Shannon is the founder and CEO of Pillar, a volunteer-driven organization dedicated to providing peer support after suicide. With over a decade of experience in suicide postvention, Shannon brings a wealth of knowledge and personal experience to this conversation. She is also a member of the Suicide Prevention Resource Center's Lived Experience Advisory Committee, where she advocates for suicide law survivors and amplifies available community supports. Before we begin, I also want to share a little bit about NAMI-NYC. We offer free classes, 40 support groups, family mentoring, a helpline, and more for families and individuals affected by mental illness. Support groups of note include Living with Thoughts of Suicide, family and friends of those living with thoughts of suicide, and suicide law survivors. Our helpline is also available if you or a loved one needs to talk or find the right program. You can call us at 212-684-3264 or visit www.naminyc.org/helpline. If you need any assistance at all, please let us know in the chat. Now let's get started. Please join me in welcoming Shannon Donick.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for being here, and truly thank you so much to NAMI for making the time to, create this space for us to talk about something as important as supporting suicide law survivors. This has been National Suicide Prevention Month. So again, just so much gratitude to NAMI for, elevating this topic this month and including myself and allowing me to talk about the importance of peer support. I do want to just take a moment and acknowledge that there's most likely some suicide law survivors on the discussion tonight, as well as folks who have maybe experienced their own suicide ideation and or suicide attempt. And so I just want to, call to mind, this might be a tough topic tonight for anyone, any of the people that I've already mentioned, or just anyone on the call. Certainly, this isn't always something that we're talking about on a daily basis. So I so appreciate you making the time to come here to learn more. But I also just want to remind you to just be gentle with yourself. We'll be talking about this we'll be on this call for probably about an hour and a half. So there may be times when you just need to step away, and please feel free to do that. You've noticed that they're recording, NAMI is taking the time to record this discussion, and they'll be, sending out a link to that recording as well as the slides. So if you're worried about missing something, please take care of yourself first. We'll make sure that you get the information And then that way you have it in your hands so you can, look back at it when it's more appropriate. Feel free to turn off your camera if that's better too. Just wanted to like set those ground rules, because I know sometimes that's, something that folks are worried about during a discussion like this. And I want that to be the last thing that you're worried about tonight. Take care of yourself first. So we'll go ahead and get started by looking at what exactly are we going to be talking about tonight. We'll start just kind of going with an overview of what exactly makes suicide bereavement different. That's probably the most common question I receive. I think we all in some way know that suicide bereavement is different than general grief, but we're not exactly sure how or why. And that certainly can help or hinder how we connect with suicide loss survivors. So we'll jump right into that. We'll also look at who exactly is a suicide loss survivor. When we're talking about that, it'll be helpful to have a clear definition. And then I'm sure there are some folks on tonight who are interested in learning how can I talk with a suicide loss survivor? Maybe there's someone in your family or in your circle that you'd like to support, but you're not even sure how you can address them. What can you say? What can't you say? We'll get into that. And then before we close up, we'll highlight certain resources that'll be really helpful to suicide loss survivors, and we'll certainly focus on self-care, because if we're anyone who's here, hoping to support someone, you need to also support yourself. So I think it's always good for us to just take a step back, remind ourselves that we need to be taking care of ourselves. So, like I said, we'll get started with just looking at how is suicide bereavement different. First we'll start with looking at grief, at general grief. We know that grief is a natural reaction to loss. It can be complex, it can be overwhelming. It's a natural reaction to losing someone that we cared about. And this can be overwhelming, even when suicide is not involved in the death. It's an extremely personal experience, right? It's a reflection of the unique relationship that you shared with the person who died. It's multifaceted. We know that grief has the capacity to impact grievers in physical ways, psychological ways, spiritual ways, interpersonal and behavioral ways. I'm sure everyone on this call has at some point experienced the death of a loved one. And so I'm sure coming to mind right now are some of those emotions that they're a bit universal. Numbness, sadness, despair, loneliness, yearning for the person who died, anger, then things like forgetfulness, irritability, fatigue, changes in appetite, worry. The list goes on and on. And so that's when we're just looking at general grief without adding in the complication of suicide. So let's look at how does it change when we're dealing with suicide loss. And so I just need to scoot our faces over a little bit so that I can see the words. So suicide-related grief can be associated with great emotional pain and profound distress, including intense feelings of guilt, perceived responsibility, shock, shame, rejection, and abandonment. Additionally, they may experience anger, relief, and thoughts of suicide. So there's a couple pieces here that I really want to make sure we focus on. First of all, those thoughts of suicide. We'll get into that in a little bit, but I always like to make sure to point that out, because oftentimes that can be the scariest part of losing someone to suicide, is suddenly having those thoughts yourself, especially if it's not something that you've ever experienced before. And so it seems to be helpful for folks to know that that's very common. It's our brain's way of trying to make sense of what just happened. This is someone that we cared deeply about, and we just learned that they died by suicide. Our brain is going to want to kind of try to imagine what they were experiencing as a way to make sense of it and as a way to maybe get closer to the loved one. So just know that that's very common. Again, we'll get into that a little bit more, but another piece that shows up in suicide loss that doesn't often show up in other types of death is that perceived responsibility. We just are left often thinking that there should have been something that we could have done. And that's actually not true. There's a leader in the suicide loss space named Dr. Jack Jordan, and he calls this, I always thought this was just like such a nice phrase to kind of grasp it, is the tyranny of hindsight. And that is just, it can seem like we have responsibility and it can seem like we should have done something more when we're where we are looking back. You know, hindsight is always 20/20. And so he would often say to a loss survivor that, I understand that you feel that you need to put yourself on trial, but I want to make sure that you're getting a fair trial. And so that's something that happens to loss survivors, is again, kind of replaying those last interactions that we had with our loved one and just kind of looking for where should I have known? And of course, again, you couldn't have known at that time what was going to happen. And so it's really just, it's not being fair with yourself, but it is, you know, again, this is like pointing out some of those experiences that the loss survivor will have on top of all of those other, you know, emotions that we already described by losing anyone. Now this is losing someone to suicide. There's an added weight there. Suicide loss survivors often feel that their grief is quite distinct, that only another loss survivor can truly understand what they're going through. They are feeling isolated. They're maybe even feeling judged or blamed, and they're looking to be able to connect with someone who gets it. And so this is really why peer support is so important for loss survivors, and why you might even notice that a lot of the resources that are available to loss survivors are in this peer space, because they often feel that their grief is quite distinct, because we do kind of notice that it is. Like we've just highlighted some of these experiences that are very different from losing a loved one in another way. You know, for one thing, it could have been a complete shock, which is something that's really different. Losing anyone at any time, of course, is devastating. But if the person that you are now grieving was, you know, had a long-term illness, there can be sort of a sense of at least some way of closure, or some way it feels like you were able to maybe say goodbye. You kind of saw that this was coming. And so in suicide, if it was a complete shock, a complete surprise, you didn't have any of that. So you're really just left with this abrupt, you know, gaping hole in your life, and you're not really sure how to navigate this or how to understand. And so being able to talk to someone else who had that experience. Another reason that it can be pretty shocking, and it can feel like you really can only connect with someone else who's been through it, is that feeling of relief that I mentioned in the first bullet point. This can actually be the case for someone who maybe their loved one had actually been experiencing suicidal ideation or a series of attempts leading up to their death. It can actually feel like a sense of relief to know that this person is no longer suffering, and that, you know, depending on how much of a caregiver you were, what kind of role you had, it may actually feel like, you know, something has kind of been lifted from your plate in a way, of course, shifting in some of these other emotions. But that can be such a surprise. And often people are feeling an additional layer of guilt then. Once they recognize that they're feeling relieved, they feel bad for feeling relieved. And so again, sometimes only speaking to another loss survivor gives them, you know, that feeling of being seen and by someone who understands, without feeling judged. And unfortunately, we know that suicide loss survivors can experience some judgment. This is something that, you know, again, kind of just going back to what we were saying before of our brains trying to make sense. Our brains are always trying to make sense of death, right? We're always trying, our brains are really trying to avoid death in any way that it can to protect us. So what happens is, you know, you might even think of conversations you've had with other people, and when we find out that someone died, someone often asks, you know, oh, how did they die, or what was it that led to the death? Because we're trying to look for how can we avoid that? And so with suicide, it often kind of feels like, well, a hopeless feeling. And so we may directly or indirectly start to kind of judge the person, thinking that maybe they should have somehow known, they should have somehow been able to stop this person. And so, unfortunately, in some cases, that actually is even stated to the loss survivor. And so obviously that can be, you know, just excruciating to have to live through. And what the loss survivor is actually having to do there is manage that other person's fear, right? That's really what's happening, is it's coming from fear. It's coming from, you know, just misunderstanding themselves. And so that kind of leads into the next point here, that family and friends may disappear from the lives of the bereaved because suicide death is so misunderstood, because we don't know what to say. We don't know how to approach the new loss survivor. We don't know how to support this person. We may just, you know, completely ignore them, step away. Again, we may not even realize we're doing it, but it can be so uncomfortable. A lot of times, if we're not sure how to approach someone, we may just kind of choose to not approach them at all. And that's something that we really hear from loss survivors when they're going back to work, when their life is starting to, or at least their routine is trying to kind of resume what life was like before. They'll notice that a lot of people, because they don't want to say the wrong thing, just don't say anything. And that only makes our loss survivor feel like even more alone. Looking at some of the other things here, suicide loss survivors often feel that they were somehow responsible for the death, could have or should have done something more to prevent the death. So that's kind of what I was describing already before. It's just, we, you know, this is something we know, that there are someone who is struggling with suicidal ideation, they can exhibit warning signs. And so that is something that we're, you know, trying to become better at identifying, but ultimately there's no way that we could have ever truly stopped another person. And even if you feel that you stopped that person once, you can't be with someone 24/7 and can't ever know exactly what's going on in someone's mind. So it's really just completely unfair. It's something that, you know, it's an experience that a loss survivor often must put themselves through, it kind of like we were saying, like going through putting themselves on trial. But at a certain point, you know, this is not something that you could have saved, and it's not fair to continue putting that blame on yourself. They'll struggle with questions of meaning making around the death. So again, just trying to make sense of this. How could this have happened, and why? Why did my loved one do this? Why did it get to this point? Why did my loved one do this to me? Sometimes there can be feelings of like that this was a forced, you know, abandonment. So, and those questions we can just kind of get in this circle of rumination, because our loved one is no longer here. We're not able to ask them what they were thinking in that moment, or how did it get to that point. So without being able to get an answer, those questions just keep circling and circling. Suicide loss survivors often show higher levels of feelings of guilt, blame, and responsibility for the death than other mourners, that I should have been able to prevent this. And suicide loss survivors may experience heightened feelings of rejection or abandonment by the loved one, along with anger toward the deceased. How could they do this to me, right? Feeling that it was something, it was specific and it was personal to the loss survivor. And certainly worth noting is that this loss may have been a traumatic event. And so that's something I want to spend some time on too, just because this is something that can be unique to a suicide loss, in that if the suicide took place in the home, a lot of immediately that home can turn into a crime scene. And so you're already grieving your loved one, and now all of a sudden you may be kept from being able to go into your home for anywhere from 12 to 24 to 48 hours. Also, if the suicide loss survivor was present for the death and the police are involved, it's typically interrogation. And so again, you're already grieving. You can't even make sense of what just happened. And now the police are asking you all of these very intense questions. It can feel very hostile, when really what you need there is comfort and support. And then certainly if you were a witness to the death, that is now, you know, a traumatic event seared onto your brain. You've got these images within your brain. And so that's truly something where we're going to have to start looking for something like PTSD, which is, you know, you'll need to look into getting professional help, looking into a therapist who's trained for trauma, looking for a clinician, you know, so just highlighting the fact that this is truly a trauma, losing someone to suicide, and particularly if it became, like I said here, a traumatic event. So just really wanting to call attention to how important this is, and how drawing attention to the weight of this, losing someone to suicide. So we've kind of talked a little bit about the suicide bereavement in defining that, but let's define who we're talking about when we're saying suicide loss survivor. And this is something that it's actually, for decades now, we've been trying to come up with a good, solid definition of loss survivor. And initially, it really was just the kin to the deceased for a long, long time. That's really what, and quite frankly, in certain places, that's really what we still mostly think of is, siblings, parents, spouses, those people who are closest to the person who died by suicide. That's kind of like your natural reaction to who a loss survivor would be. And when supports were popping up initially for loss survivors, we mostly saw those relationships highlighted. And certainly those are loss survivors. But what we're learning now is that we could expand that definition to exposure of any suicide, quite frankly, and the psychological proximity to the deceased. So, looking at just kind of, sorry, I was just like, there was one more thing here. Oh yeah, that, we wanna look at not just that the relationship is by blood, not those, again, those main connections to this deceased, but it's all about how close you felt to the deceased. And I wanted to just, the reason I was just scrambling for my notes is because I wanted to make sure to word it that way, because that's what we're hearing from loss survivors is that there's already, as we've just discussed, isolation from the outside world, but then within the suicide loss survivor community, the last thing we want to do is add any more exclusion. So we want to make sure that we, especially now, especially in 2024, when we're doing more and more parts of our life virtual, just like this talk tonight, we have a lot of connections with folks who we may not see on a regular basis, or who we may not even ever have met, face to face. That's a strong connection, and so we want to make space for that. And so this is where bringing us to this longer definition that I included here. This is by Dr. Jack Jordan, who I just mentioned, and it's from a book that he wrote with Dr. John McIntosh, Grief After Suicide, Understanding the Consequences and Caring for the Survivors. They define suicide loss survivor as someone who experiences a high level of self-perceived psychological, physical, and/or social distress for a considerable length of time as a result of the suicide of another person. So what does that mean? That is actually, to me, that's highlighting some of these sort of other relationships, right? This is we hear from folks who have lost a neighbor, a coworker to suicide. If you think about it, like these are people that have, like, we make a connection with these folks, and these could be people that you lived next door to for years. Maybe you never really got into a full, like, long, lifelong discussion, but certainly that was someone that had a meaningful connection to you. And to learn that that person died by suicide, just the weight behind suicide, the fact that that person made that decision is really what we're going to be ultimately grieving. And so we want to make space for that. Again, I'll go into a little bit more towards the end, some of the peer support that we do at Pillar, but this is where it's important for us to look at who self-describes, who defines themselves as a loss survivor, and making sure that that person is finding the space for support and the space to grieve appropriately, whether or not it's what maybe what we consider a suicide loss survivor. If they identify as one, we want to be able to be there to support them. And so then the big question, and really kind of why we're all here tonight, is, are survivors at risk for suicide? And really the question that most people ask is, are survivors at risk for, at higher risk for suicide? And so as as I mentioned at the beginning, suicidality, which is experiencing the thoughts of suicide, it's not uncommon in loss survivors. And so, kind of this is a sort of an imagery that we sometimes describe as that suicide loss survivors need to try on the shoes of their loved one, but they need to make sure to take them off. And so what that means is, again, our brain is trying to protect us and also trying to make sense of this, this huge experience that we're living through of losing our loved one to suicide. And we're just wondering how did this happen? What were they going through? Sometimes we need to understand what was their mindset when this was happening. And so it's really us trying to put ourselves in their shoes, trying to try on those shoes. But we want to make sure that there's space for the loss survivor to take them off. And that space would be, again, that peer support and definitely that professional support that we're touched on towards the end. We want to make sure that they've got some experienced guides around them to kind of get them through that experience, because we don't want anyone else to have to take on this suicidality and then potentially, take their own life by suicide. So we want to make sure that we're getting them the support that they need so that this is where we can save lives with postvention. And again, I keep saying this, but it's true that our brains are wired to learn all we can so that we know how this happened, we know what to avoid. And so we just want to make sure that we're taking the space, we're going through this as part of the, part of the recovery and the healing, but not being trapped in that rumination cycle. And so, we're going to get into how to talk to a loss survivor, but certainly, when you are speaking with loss survivors and when you're discussing their lost loved ones, it's not uncommon for survivors to yell or to cry. We always want to point that out because we're going to be talking about something very emotional, something very personal. So it certainly, as emotions come up, it's of course makes sense to be expressing sadness through tears or anger through yelling or any number of things. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're distressed or suicidal, but certainly trust your gut, share resources if you're feeling concerned with the person that you're speaking with. And so I keep saying this, but we'll go over some more resources towards the end, but these are good. Honestly, these are good to just have. We never know what someone's going through, anyone that we're talking to, not just suicide loss survivors. But what is important, what I like to mention about the crisis text line and the 988 suicide and crisis lifeline is that loss survivors don't always realize that those services are available to them. So often, folks just don't want to be a burden. They're worried that they're tying up the line, when someone else, might be experiencing something quote unquote worse. And so what we've heard actually is that's, they're ready to take our calls or our communications. Crisis text line, I've heard such great things because you can be in a professional setting and you can be reaching out to someone. You might be in a meeting and you can be texting a crisis text line counselor if you're just having a rough time and no one else even needs to know about it. And you're right there in real time getting the support that you need. And I know, at the beginning, Aubrey and Barbara even talked about the line that NAMI has. So again, we'll highlight some of these resources towards the end, but it's just really great to know that those resources are available to everyone, including loss survivors. So again, we wanted to talk a little bit about how to speak with a suicide loss survivor, what to say, what not to say. And so we're starting with just like tips to keep in mind, because I'm sure, like I said, I'm sure some of you are on this call because you've got someone in mind that you're thinking of, that you're maybe a little bit worried about, and you wanted to reach out to them, or maybe you just want to know what is good practice. So first thing to always think of, and I always write this down for myself, is to pause and take a breath. Because, maybe it might just be coming up. You might just be in a conversation with someone and it comes up that they've recently experienced suicide loss. And so I'm very sorry, my cat is screaming at me right now. But you might not have even realized, you might have been talking to someone, you might not have even realized that this conversation was going to maybe take a turn. So just pausing and taking a breath can just reset our own mind, try to put our own nervous system, to kind of reset in and get ready for this, and to just meet the loss survivor with empathy, letting them know that you're here to listen. If they feel safe, they're going to be more likely to open up to you. So most, an impromptu conversation like this is probably someone who you're already close with. This could be someone that you're already friends with or a coworker you see often. So to keep that in mind, you know, obviously this is a connection you have because you both have, you know, you both respect each other, you both care about each other. So just bringing yourself back to those basics. You know, the brain is gonna, we're starting to get nervous if we want to do the right thing and we're nervous about saying the wrong thing. So trying to calm ourselves back down and just remember, this is someone that I care about and I want them to feel safe. I want them to feel ready and able to open up to me. Be aware of the tone of your voice, be aware of the speed of your speech. This is something I constantly have to remind myself about because I'm a very fast talker. I'm really trying to slow it down tonight. I'm not sure if I'm succeeding, but that's something too. You know, when your mind is racing, your speech starts to race too. So try to remind yourself to slow it down and just, again, be aware of the tone of your voice. Sometimes this is what we hear from folks is that it's not even so much the words. They, especially if this is a new loss survivor, they might still be in that initial like stage of fog and just the clouds that come with like losing someone at, you know, again, that's kind of a general grief situation, but in suicide, it can be even more mind-boggling. So they're not going to remember the specific words that you're using, but they will remember you were there and they will remember that you had an empathetic, warm tone, you know, so sometimes it's just even reminding ourselves, what do we want to hear? What is going to help us open up to someone and trying to create that space for the suicide loss survivor. Validate them that it's understandable to feel however they're feeling. Remind them that grief can look different than they were expecting. You know, that's something that we often hear from loss survivors is that, you know, again, kind of like how we started tonight, they may have already experienced grief by losing loved ones to any number of different, you know, conditions or diseases or whatever it may be, and that it can be a surprise to then lose this loved one to suicide and realize how different it's affecting them. What also can happen is once you've experienced losing someone to suicide, then future deaths, whether it is by suicide or not, can actually really change as well. And so that's something that, you know, so that may be something that they're really like grappling with, is that this is really different and I did not expect that. And that might be something that they just want to open up to you about. And so just, you know, validating that it could be different, validating, like if they start describing something to you and it's totally different than your experience, hopefully you're both, you know, able to validate each other that as much as grieving can be universal, again, it's so unique to our own experience with our loved one and our own, you know, immediate circumstances, that there will be nuances always that are a little bit different. And so making space for that. We're all grieving in different ways. You know, they may, again, I list a few other emotions here that are sometimes surprising to folks: disbelief, anger, sadness, multitude of different other difficult emotions. That disbelief is something that really comes up a lot now, again, when we're, you know, maybe, you know, kind of like I was using that example of becoming close to someone that we don't live near, that maybe most of our relationship is made up with virtual connections or texting or phone calls. It can be really difficult to wrap our head around and truly understand that that person's no longer here if we weren't able to see it with our, you know, within our mind. And so that can be pretty surprising and uncomfortable to navigate alone. So, you know, again, and obviously it could be any number of things beyond this. So just trying to meet that loss survivor with empathy and being prepared for maybe whatever might come up in the conversation. And so, probably won't spend too much time on all of this since I don't want us to go over at all in time, but, and again, this is all going to be sent to you, so you'll have it. But I know folks often ask me for like the specific language that they can use when they're talking with loss survivors. And I know it can be helpful to just have something like this to, you know, you don't have to specifically read, you know, these specific questions to folks, but I'm hopeful that this is going to give you an idea of how then to turn it into your own language, right? And certainly, you know, turn it into the relationship that you have with the loss survivor. So, you know, one way to kind of start things, if let's say that someone in your life has experienced suicide loss and you'd like to schedule a call to talk with them, or maybe you're going to try to meet up, or, the next time that you're getting together, you want to talk with them, but you're not sure. And so what we hear a lot is that folks are really nervous about bringing up suicide loss, or bringing up the lost loved one. And what loss survivors routinely remind us is that they're not ever not thinking about their loved one. And so they actually would really welcome the opportunity to be able to talk about their lost loved one. So, even just starting something gently about wanting to know a little bit about the loved one, who they were, before they died by suicide. What was their relationship? What was something that, what was the favorite food? What was a favorite color? What was something that you all loved to do together? These can be great ways to just kind of get the conversation flowing for both of you, to kind of help both of you start to feel at ease. And again, just kind of like a more gentle way of being able to let the loss survivor know that you're eager to talk about this person that died by suicide, and helping them to kind of warm up to it. What's a special day you remember spending with your loved one? Would you mind telling me about it? Of course, being mindful of the fact that maybe not every relationship was a positive relationship. And so just, maybe it's not that you want to talk about a special day, but looking for like just a favorite memory. Even just like, if maybe you don't need the specifics, just what's been on your mind lately. What is it that, is kind of bringing this up now? Because, this is a good point for us to remember that grieving, whether it's, a loved one to suicide, or, any sort of grief, that healing is not linear, right? It's something that I know for myself, and I know for many others, is like quite a source of frustration, because we really want to be able to plan out, okay, I'm going to feel like this for this amount of time, and then I'm going to feel like this, and we want to see improvement. And certainly for the most part, we'll know that, like, as we're going up and down, we are making some, quote unquote progress. But there can be those days that can really just unexpectedly, suddenly we're thinking the grief, the loss of our loved one is just weighing on us a little bit more than another day. And so just being able to say, hey, I'm noticing that it looks like you've got a lot on your mind today. What's been on your mind lately about your mom, or, whoever it was that they lost? Would you like to tell me something that you haven't been able to share with anyone else? That's actually comes straight from loss survivors. It's something that they would like to be asked. So I like to point that out. And also just that last part, what needs to be said out loud? And so that might be something you may have experienced yourself. And, it might be related to suicide, or even just anything. Sometimes when we're carrying something and we're kind of, something's weighing on us, we're kind of tossing it around in our mind. Just being able to say it is going to be able to kind of like help us start to make sense of it, and start to move forward. And so it can feel really nice to be able to say that in a safe space. And so if you've been able to create that space for this loss survivor, we know that that can be really beneficial. Also, sometimes, as the loss survivor is opening up to you and sharing so much of their very personal story, sometimes we're just not really sure what to say there. We may know, like, we may start off everything, we're breathing, we're pausing, we're reminding ourselves to be empathetic, and we're nodding along and being as caring as we can. But all of a sudden, it almost feels like there are no words to be able to give back to this person, that would kind of, they're sharing so much and we're not sure what to say back. So here's just a list. Again, this is just kind of like an example of things that we've heard that are helpful for loss survivors, but absolutely, you'll probably kind of put on your own flavor. But, it sounds like this grief is unbearable. I appreciate you reaching out to talk, honored to listen. It really is an honor to bear witness for a loss survivor. And so, just being able to say that is like something that's putting it out there, reminding them that you're here to listen, to anything else that they'd like to share about that experience, that they do deserve this space to heal and to talk. Sometimes just remembering that they might not have other supportive contacts in their life. So for you to be able to say these healing words to them is really impactful. Again, healing is not linear, so loss can feel painful even long after the date of the death. There's no timeline for grief, and it's okay to move along at your own pace. Again, that's another one that's really, we've heard a lot of loss survivors just appreciate you understanding that, you know, it could be months, it could be years later that all of a sudden it'll just be they're thinking about their loved one. And so if you're able to kind of go along that journey with them and understand that there's no timeline, they're going to be really appreciative. And then certainly, I know one conversation won't take away this pain, but reaching out shows how strong you are. Your courage is admirable. Again, putting on your own flavor here, adjusting this for whatever relationship you might have with the lost survivor. But these are just kind of like ways to kind of keep the conversation moving when you're not really sure what else to say. And then closing up the conversation, you know, again, that can kind of feel like, how am I ever supposed to close this up? We just talked about this really heavy stuff. Maybe we were just at lunch, you know, maybe you were just grabbing coffee and didn't realize that the conversation would go into this. And so it can kind of feel like, how do I close this? But hopefully the lost survivor, your friend, or whoever it is that you're speaking to was able to kind of say what needed to be said that day. And if that happened, you know, you may be able to pick up from them like a little bit of like an ease that they have about themselves. So again, these are just some examples that the goal can't be to suddenly fix everything, but hold space, you know, let them know that they can come back to talk with you, so that they can feel less alone. And to, you know, start validating whatever experiences and emotions they may be feeling now. It may be different, you know, it may even go kind of up and down while you're talking. They may have been really anxious, so relieved then to be able to connect with you, but maybe as you were talking through things, some other things popped up, sadness. You know, now they're maybe feeling a little bit stressed about going back into the world where it's maybe not quite so safe as this space that you provided for them. So just remind them that reaching out is such an important first step. You're grateful to be there with them. Perhaps you'll be there, you know, for them in the future. And then end conversations by reviewing available resources, which we're going to look at some of those links coming up. But as a preview, it's NAMI-NYC, Pillar, local and online support groups, and other mental health organizations or facilities, especially anything that maybe you have familiarity with, that you know and trust, that you could pass on to someone. But certainly I do want to make sure that we're taking care of you in these conversations, because as I even just mentioned at the beginning, this is a heavy topic, right? And so this person that you have a connection with, that you are making space for them to open up to you, they are now sharing some very private, very personal details, and certainly could be traumatic, could be very scary for both of you to have to hear. So be aware of your own boundaries. It's absolutely okay to bring this discussion to a close if you are not able to hold an emotional conversation in this moment. You know, maybe you thought that this was a good time, and maybe it's just not. And maybe too that when kind of going back to what I was mentioning about how there can feel like there are some words that need to come out. Maybe you were trying to make space for that, and it turns out the words that are coming out are just not words that you are able to hear, and that is okay. You really need to trust your own boundaries. And again, we're talking about something that is that can be very traumatic, and so can absolutely require the working with a professional, and that's okay, because I mean, wouldn't we all, if we saw someone who, you know, was in an accident and had a broken leg, you know, we would absolutely make sure that a professional doctor was there to perform surgery to make sure that that leg gets better. So it's the same situation here. We can support that person by making sure they've got the crutches they need, by, you know, helping them navigate once they've had that surgery. But there's a part that they absolutely needed to see a professional for. And so that's the same thing here. So if it comes up that you're trying to connect with this lost survivor, you're trying to have this powerful conversation, and it turns out it's just they need to share something that is not good for you to hear, that's absolutely okay. And so just let them know. This is again, I've just got an example here, worded the way that it would work for you, but just mentioning to them that you can talk, you know, there's certain things that you can talk about. But I wish I could be here for you in this way, but I just can't. Have you explored this yet with a mental health professional or therapist? In the meantime, I'd love to hear more about and try to pivot over to maybe some of that part of the conversation that felt a little bit safer for you. It's still going to be showing that you're there for them, but you're showing exactly how you can be there for them, right? And making sure that they know how to find that other support that is available to them. And then, again, thank you for sharing with me. I do need to get going, but I'm really grateful that we were able to talk, because certainly, depending on when the conversation comes to a close, there might be times when you need to step away, and that's fine. Just letting them know that. So also, and I just want to check, looks like we're doing okay on time. So we just want to highlight some of those resources. Thank you to you for being able to have that initial call with them, or that initial conversation. Again, this could be a family member, this could be a coworker, this could be a friend, but wanting to make sure then that they'll be able to get into that space where they'll be able to connect with peers, and they'll connect with those professional supports that they need. So we listed a few things here. As a reminder, this will be, you'll be receiving this in your email, but this link out to those NAMI-NYC support groups that were mentioned at the beginning. If you go to that first link, you'll be able to see they keep a full comprehensive list of support groups in the area, which is really helpful. They're not all specific to suicide. And I've been sharing that with everyone that I talk with, just because it's helpful for folks to make sure to get all the support that they can get. I used to always say to people to try to triple and double dip as much as possible. So definitely those thoughts of suicide support groups, and the suicide loss specific support groups, which is nice, especially that they're in person and online. Yes, those are absolutely probably priority number one there. But there's so many other mental health related support groups on there that our loss survivor may notice that there's other places that they could hop in and get an extra layer of support. And that's particularly important if they're noticing that some of their already built-in support system, if they're experiencing anyone kind of moving away, like we talked about at the beginning, if people are just stopping talking with them because they're not sure what to say, they're going to need to rebuild a new support system for themselves. So making sure that they can get that in multiple ways. The other aspect that I forgot to mention earlier, but I'd like to mention here as we're talking about these support groups, is that something to keep in mind for when related to suicide loss, when we're looking at families who have lost a member of the family to suicide, what we'll notice is that it doesn't necessarily, because that grief and that bereavement they're experiencing is unique to your own relationship with the loved one, you and your sibling could be experiencing something completely different. You and your spouse, you and your parents, you could be grieving the loss of the same person and going through it completely differently. And so that actually too adds another layer of complication for this experience. But that's where knowing that there's multiple support groups for folks is really helpful, because it may be that, you each kind of want to split off. You want to have your own space to talk with this group, and your other family member wants to have their own space with a different group. It's really important to make sure that you're both able to kind of grieve the way you need to grieve, so that then you can support each other when you're together. Therapy listed a few different places here. Certainly, I think probably Psychology Today is the most commonly known, but what's really nice is places like Inclusive Therapists have a lot of drop downs that you can kind of filter out for someone who is that it can be really important to make sure you're talking to someone who is sensitive. If you are a loss survivor and gender nonconforming, a member of the LGBTQ+ community, or any other identities that are really important to you, Inclusive Therapists is incredibly it's really nice to see that we can kind of navigate that ourselves, and it feels like we've got the power to find someone who will align with us, because again, this is going to be a pretty deep and intense and personal conversation talking about losing someone to suicide. So making sure that you feel comfortable, or that the loss survivor feels comfortable with the professional. And then listed a couple other places here, Talkspace and BetterHelp are online, and just always trying to make it a little bit easier, because certainly, finding a therapist can be really difficult. It's absolutely worthwhile once you do find that person that you connect with, but it can be pretty difficult. So, anything that you can do to kind of help the loss survivor navigate that, I'm sure would be appreciated. And then Alliance of Hope is something that I mentioned always. They're an incredible organization that has for years now has had a 24/7 monitored online forum. So you just go to the website, and at the top you can see that you can just click on it says like take me to the forum or something like that. And it's where loss survivors can digitally and virtually like speak with other loss survivors. The communication is monitored 24/7 by social workers, so you can trust that that's a safe environment. And it's so helpful, especially in those early days. I mean, truly always, but especially in those early days when we really hear from loss survivors that they are having trouble sleeping, that they're feeling like, they want to talk at like 3 a.m., but who can you call at 3 a.m.? Or even if you do have those close friends that you can call, at all hours of the night, they'll often feel like they've kind of exhausted that group of friends. So if they feel like they don't know where else to go and they're in between support group meetings or in between therapy meetings, the Alliance of Hope is an incredible organization that they can get that support at any time. And then I just wanted to draw attention to Pillar, which is Peer Support After Suicide, which is the organization that I founded. And it really is trying to bring peer support to those who've experienced suicide. We provide peer-to-peer connection. So if you are a loss or attempt survivor and would like to speak to another loss or attempt survivor, you can reach out to, I've got my email here, or the website there to do so. We're relatively new, so can't guarantee that we'd be able to find a volunteer within your city, but even if we need to connect you with someone further across the country, we have seen such benefits to being able to talk to another peer, again, kind of just to be able to validate all of those concerns that we listed at the beginning, to be able to speak to someone who gets it, who's been there, and who's been there a little bit longer ago. All of our volunteers are at least 2 to 3 years removed from their own experience. So they're able to listen. They're also able to answer some questions. Certainly a lot of us are going to have the same question of, why did this happen? How did this happen? But other questions our volunteers can speak to, things like, what is it like to go to a support group? What is it like to go to a therapist? This is something that not everyone has already gone to a therapist. And so there can be some nerves associated with reaching out for help. What is it really going to be like? And so our volunteer can just certainly normalize that experience. Where do I start? Our volunteer can share some of those links that we were just discussing. Something else that we are, and I'm going to touch on before I wrap up here, something that we are launching next week actually is a podcast that I hope will be another layer of just like a layer of entry, quite frankly, for loss and attempt survivors to find their way into this community of support. Because a lot of what the main supports that we talked about here for loss survivors are support groups or therapy, and both of those involved speaking, right? And so it can often feel like a space where you really need to put on your extroverted mask in order to get any support. And I know that that's so uncomfortable to folks who just don't like speaking about anything personal to begin with. And now we're asking them to speak about something that's the most personal. So I was hopeful, and I will be hopeful, and I will know more once it's launched. But by providing a podcast that is interviewing loss and attempt survivors, my hope is that folks who have been hesitant about reaching out to resources and supports will be able to just kind of put on their headphones, listen to someone share their own experience. And then my hope is that if it's a loss or attempt survivor who's listening, they'll be able to, kind of notice there's certain things that are universal to these experiences. And again, there's nuances for all of us that'll make it a little bit different. But my hope is that just hearing from someone else and then tuning in each week and hearing another story and hearing another story, and being able to realize that there are some pieces of our stories that connect, that they'll feel that level of connection that we're hoping to provide, so that maybe with time, after listening to a few of those episodes, they would feel more prepared to reach out and maybe attend a support group, or certainly reach out to a therapist and make sure that they're able to talk through a little bit of this. So let me just see if there was anything else I wanted to touch on before we circle over to taking questions. But really, at the very least, I hope you're feeling a little bit more prepared to be able to have that conversation with someone, or at least, just having that awareness. It's all of these pieces that we touched on are, tiny little, I say the word nuance a lot, but it really is. It's like slight little nuances in order to connect with the loss survivor. And it may not seem a lot, but it truly, we know that that's impactful. We know that those little pieces are helping to make the loss survivor feel less alone. And we know that that's crucial in saving lives. We know that isolation is a factor for nearly anything. And feeling isolated, feeling disconnected from the rest of our community, of our greater world, is certainly something that is not good for any of us. And so being able to provide that connection for our loss survivor is so helpful. Knowing, just like I said, knowing that they want to talk about their loved one, that they welcome the opportunity to share a story with you, is so helpful. And the last thing before I wrap up actually is I just wanted to, something I forgot to mention earlier, is just the power of language. And so we talked about being empathetic. We talked about, providing that space for the loss survivor to open up. But one thing that's really important is that we're, as a movement, those of us within the suicide awareness community and support community are moving away from the term commit suicide. So that may be something that you maybe already learned, but I just wanted to make sure to take the space to point that out. We instead make sure to say died by suicide, or killed himself or killed herself or their self, rather than using that word commit, because again, that goes back to that feeling that that judgment. Commit is a term that folks are, you commit a crime, but this wasn't that, and we don't want folks to ever feel like that. So even just something little, by speaking to a loss survivor, approaching them, and for them to realize that you're using that language that takes away that judgment, that in fact you really are meeting them where they're at, goes so far in helping them feel that they can open up to you, and that maybe it'll be a little less scary moving forward and navigating this space, looking for other supports. So let me just see. Oh, and we need to support you too. So I want to make sure before we close up that I take just a few minutes here just to talk about self-care. This is something even for all of you tonight, honestly, probably, again, depending, not knowing everyone's story here, like I said, I'm sure many of you are loss survivors or have had some experience in this space, but I would imagine some folks are brand new. And so either way, depending on what you've already got going on in your life, this could be a little bit of a weighty conversation. So I want to make sure that you're taking some time for yourself, and just ask yourself, what does self-care look like for you? I'll be honest, there was a time when I had no idea what self-care was. I just heard everyone talk about it, and I wasn't very good at doing it myself. And so sometimes just Googling to find out what are like some examples of self-care can help you, because as you look through that list, you'll notice, what you do respond to and what you're thinking to yourself, no, I would never do that. So like bubble baths are so great for some folks. Other people are like, no way. I need to be painting, or I need to be reading, or I need to be walking. So whatever it is for you, create a self-care plan for yourself that will help you re-regulate yourself after a tough encounter, and have a few examples to yourself. Because again, it might depend on what the day, it might depend on, the weather, it might depend on, sometimes conversations like this, when they're a little bit weightier, can either, might actually kind of speed your insides up, all of a sudden you're feeling anxious, or it might just be draining, so definitely have a few different options available to yourself so that what to reach for and when. And then certainly if you're a loss survivor yourself, or an attempt survivor, monitor your own loss, monitor whatever's going on within yourself. I mean, this could honestly even be something, like you might have a lot on your plate at work or at home. Monitor what's going on with yourself. And then if you're speaking with this friend or this family member, try to make sure to make time for yourself to, prioritize checking back in with your own therapist. If you are a loss survivor, make sure to check in with your own support group. Or if you're a facilitator of a group, maybe it's time to look at attending a different group and just seeing if you can have that space where you kind of just really be able to let your guard down without worrying about managing anyone else. And certainly sometimes we just need to take a break from this work, from being a support to other folks. Any level of caregiving to friends and family can certainly kind of put an extra bit on ourselves. And so just making sure that we are monitoring our own needs here. And so I think I'm just looking here. I think we should have enough time for plenty of questions. So I just thank you all so much. Again, thank you to NAMI for creating this space for us to have this discussion, but thank you to all of you. This isn't, I've said it a few times now, it's quite true. This isn't, the easiest conversation for any of us to sit through. And so I really appreciate you all taking time, prioritizing this topic, and doing what you can to learn more. And so now I will, and here, this was just in case anybody still needed my contact info, but you should already have it. So I'm going to stop talking and see what we need to do for questions.
Thank you, Shannon. We do have a couple of questions. One is in the chat, and it's from Michelle, and she asks, what is your definition of postvention?
So for me personally, and I mean, this is one of those things that can probably depend on, different perspectives within the field. But for me, postvention is any of these supports that come in after a suicide. So I was really speaking in this case, looking at the individual. So how to support that individual, how to get them the support that they need going forward, making sure that they have all the resources they need. A broader term for postvention, though, would certainly be if you've seen anything like within school systems, or even within some larger corporations, which is actually great to see that places are making this a priority. You may notice that these schools and some workplaces have a kind of like a protocol and like a list of steps to take after there has been a death. So all of that can be considered postvention. That's not my expertise, but I do know that that's available. And actually, I don't know, Barbara, if you have any involvement in that, you can certainly speak up. But that is, you might notice. So, if you're a parent, and you may have even heard this from your school, if they have any sort of action of steps that they're going to take if there's a death within the school, how to announce that to everyone, how they would react to that, how they would hopefully, bring in supports for the students and for the family members. All of that is considered postvention.
Thank you, Shannon. We do have a raised hand from Norcia Watim. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
You're fine. So I just wanted to ask a few questions. I know we talked about having dealing with people who's survivor, but I wanted to find out how would you prevent it. Like, for example, I know of this family who's was going through a custody case, and the daughter was like, I want to kill myself, was pulling her hair out. But just saying that out of frustration, because every time she say that, we would have to take her to the site where they have her evaluated before she come back to school. So how do we have conversations about that to that child, and or an adult, to make sure that not to trigger them, but at the same time just to do it the right way, so they won't get triggered?
Yeah, I mean, so that I would say And I'm not able, this is maybe something that I could grab a link and maybe I could share this with you, Barbara, and you could make sure to send it out as an attachment with the rest of the materials, because that's a great question. I mean, basically what you're asking for and what you're looking for is how to take someone through an assessment when you're worried about, when you're worried about what they're thinking, if they're saying, if they're saying they're making statements that it's like, it could be passive, it could be just an exclamation of frustration in the moment, right? I think we've all, heard people say this, or maybe even said it ourselves, of like, you just kill myself right now. And it's, that maybe they don't actually mean it, but it's worth exploring to find out if this person actually is suicidal. So what I can do is pull up, there's actually, I believe it's Barbara Stanley over at Columbia. I'll find out for sure. Actually has a really nice way of walking someone through an assessment. And so you are, going to kind of build some rapport up, but eventually ask them if they're thinking about suicide. Do they have a plan? Do they have a means? And have they already set a time and a date of when they're going to take their life? And so that's when you're able to kind of determine, where does this person fit in? Do we need to immediately get support to them, in terms of, do we need to call 911 or 988 and make sure that someone can get to them? Or can we connect them with a therapist or a clinician or some other professional mental health that would be able to start to work with this person and help them, create and grab the tools that will help them through these moments.
Right, because I also have a family that the grandson is, saying they want to commit suicide, but they're not really thinking of doing the action. And then mom is afraid of him going into that phase, that depression again. I'm just trying to how does this support play into all that?
Yeah, well, so definitely. So the support that I outlined was really for folks specifically after a suicide loss. But what you're describing, I mean, really goes into, there are times when we can kind of experience chronic suicidal ideation. And so being aware of that, learning more about that would be something that would be probably really helpful for you to get a little bit more specific training for that. And so I'm probably speaking out of turn, but I'm pretty sure Columbia has something like this. So I'll find what I'm thinking of and make sure that Barbara gets it so we can get it out. But quite frankly, I mean, a person who's in a situation like you're describing, who has brought up a number of times, like whether or not they're thinking about suicide, it may not be that they have a specific plan, but even if that person, the beauty of the assessment is that it'll help us understand exactly where this person's thoughts about suicide are. But just because the person doesn't have a specific plan or a specific time and place, doesn't mean that we just brush them to the side either. That person definitely needs to be working with a therapist, working with someone who's trained in this, and probably, typically long-term, for just to be able to get them to the point where, they have some sort of like better tools to internally regulate. So that's not something, there's definitely there's advice as to how to walk someone through an assessment, but once we're working with someone who has kind of ongoing constant thoughts of suicide, we want to make sure that they're within that professional space that they need, within that therapist or that clinician who's trained for that. It's again, kind of like we were saying, sometimes there are points in our life when we have to speak and work with a medical professional. This is the same sort of situation. We want to make sure that the person who needs to be working with a clinician or a therapist trained for this, for their brains, is able to get to that person that needs that support.
Thank you, Shannon. And thank you, Norcia, for the question. We do have another question in the chat from Cindy. How do you talk to a survivor who is really mad at a friend who has taken their life, feeling that person is selfish, weak, and abandoned everyone? Yep, and this is, I'm a temp survivor, so I understand it's not selfish, but often a result of depression, but many don't.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of when it comes to, just kind of reminding ourselves that that grief is it's not linear. And so there can be points when someone can kind of be sort of stuck for a little bit. This must be something that's really that it's really taking her some time to try to wrap her head around the, you know, what led to this, and she's pissed, you know, it sounds like she's very, very angry. So that it can take a minute. Sometimes those emotions, just by talking through it once or twice, it doesn't immediately go away. Sometimes, you know, it sounds like maybe she wants to have and needs to have multiple conversations. So this is where for you, you know, certainly kind of like looking at your boundaries. And if you're getting to the point where you just maybe are just really filled with dread at the thought of speaking with a friend who's going through this again, you know, don't take that on yourself too. You know, consider, when is it okay for you to have this conversation for the, you know, 20th time? I mean, this isn't certainly even just specific to suicide loss. I know, you know, sometimes I think we've all gone through that with friends who are maybe going through a breakup or something. It can be, there's something that needs to come out, but there's a time when we get to our own limit. And so this would be where it would be really helpful to just kind of make sure that they've got those other resources. And, you know, so you can say, hey, like, even if you maybe you don't feel comfortable letting them know that you just can't have any more conversations like this. So you could just say, you know, I've got a lot on my plate right now. I'm not going to be able to speak with you as frequently or, you know, as often as we have in the past. I want to make sure though that you're able to speak to someone, because it's important to keep talking through that. And so that's where maybe making sure that she's aware of the support groups and or therapists. It's, you know, I have a therapist, and I always, you know, I always talk about him when I'm talking with folks, because it's an outside person who's not part of your life. So it actually can be really helpful to just open up to this person, and this is their job. So they're going to be there to listen to this conversation, you know, 2, 3, 20, 30 times. And so it would help take the pressure off of yourself. There's no way, unfortunately, or fortunately, there's no way for us to make someone change their opinion. That's, you know, something that they're going to have to go through themselves. And so, you know, if the concern is that she's feeling so much anger, you know, that's where she's at in the process of grieving. And so it may just be that she needs to talk through that a little bit more. And again, I'm going to keep highlighting speaking with a professional, just because we do know that it's much more complicated losing someone to suicide. So there can be these additional factors of things like I said, like I mentioned, PTSD, but certainly so many other you know, just aspects of mental health and mental illness can pop up after a suicide loss. So it's important to get them over to a professional when possible.
Thank you, Shannon. I don't see any other questions in the chat or raised hands, but just in case anyone wants to ask anything else, give it another moment or two.
I had asked in the chat, what best practices would you say are necessary for effective postvention? And if there's a toolkit that one could create, a postvention toolkit, what would it entail?
Yeah, so you're asking, it sounds like probably for a more comprehensive, like for a school or workplace?
No, generally, you know, just some best practices overall that we can probably leave with.
Yeah, I mean, as far as best practices for connecting with an individual, I would really just kind of circle back to this discussion of just being able to, if you're able to make time to connect with empathetically the loss survivor and listen to what they're going through, and then, you know, making sure that you're aware of what sort of resources are in your area, what kind of sort of supports are in your area or in their area that you could refer them over to. And, you know, honestly, if you're feeling like these conversations pop up, I know sometimes that it can feel like that, right? Like sometimes it feels like there's multiple, you know, people in our lives navigating suicide loss. So if it helps to just have some of these, you know, links saved to your desktop or, you know, saved in your phone, so that when you're talking to someone, you can just automatically like, hey, I can't talk right now. I hope we can soon. But in the meantime, you know, here's the link again to Alliance of Hope. You know, that's the one with the 24/7 forums. That way they can go and connect with others there. For me, that's really when we're talking about individual suicide loss survivors, just making sure that they are feeling seen, feeling validated, feeling heard, having that connection. And then again, that additional layer of professional support so that, because certainly I don't want any of you to feel like you have to do this all, on your own. So I don't know if, let me make sure that I highlight that, because it can definitely feel, especially if you're concerned about someone who's in your tight circle, right? Like your close friend or your close family member, close coworker, you might really be feeling like I need to make sure I have multiple conversations with this person and make sure that they, get better, quote unquote, get better, and know that that's not the expectation that you do this all, certainly. And so that's why, highlight again the times that you need for self-care and the times that you need to tap out for your own boundaries. And so that's where making sure that the loss survivor has those extra layers of support will hopefully help kind of spread things out and make them, see that there is a greater community around them. They're attending multiple support groups, able to hop online and attend that, 24/7 forum, get connected to a therapist. Sometimes within therapy groups, there's actually even additional support groups that are just for the folks who are, seeing a certain therapist. So then there's another layer of connection. So once that, loss survivor is able to have those different scenarios and where they're meeting more and more loss survivors, it's going to help alleviate the isolation, and it's going to help alleviate, all of the added conversations that can, quite frankly, kind of start to feel like a burden to us. And now, potentially you both are getting the space that you need, but still, then they're going to remember that you were there for them at the beginning. And so when you all come back together after they've kind of made it through grieving a little bit, it'll help to strengthen your relationship too.
Thank you, Shannon. And I don't think we have any more questions, so I'll pass it back over to Audrey.
Thank you. Thank you, Shannon, for sharing your insights and expertise with us tonight. And to everyone who joined, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. We want you to remember that you are not alone in this. You can check NAMI-NYC's website calendar for our upcoming support groups. And then our helpline, again, is available if you or a loved one needs to talk or find the right program for you. Our number is 212-684-3264, or you can visit www.naminyc.org/helpline. And again, we did put an evaluation in the chat. Your feedback is super important and helps us plan these future events. So we do ask that you take a few minutes to fill out the survey. And other than that, we again just thank you so much for joining us tonight, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thanks,
Have a great night.
everyone.
Thank you.